It begins with chaos, flashes of cameras, overlapping voices, distant sirens. A breaking news banner cuts across every major network. Federal audit targets California over massive fund mismanagement. The words hit like a thunderclap. Billions, not millions, billions of dollars, reportedly missing or misused, funds meant for the homeless, for wildfire prevention, for pandemic recovery, all now under federal scrutiny. The camera cuts to downtown Sacramento. The state capitol, bathed in late afternoon light, suddenly feels like the center of a political earthquake. Outside, reporters swarm. Inside, aides scramble. No one seems to know who's really in control or how deep this goes. And at the heart of it all, Gavin Newsom. He steps up to the podium, polished, confident, the California golden boy who once symbolized the Democratic Party's future. But this time, the confidence feels forced, a subtle twitch in his jaw, a longer than usual pause before he speaks. The room falls silent. Questions erupt before he even begins. Governor, did your office authorize the fund transfers? Are the homelessness project figures real? Did you know about the audit before it was announced? He stares at the crowd. Cameras flash. Microphones shake, and in that silence, that uncomfortable silence, the illusion begins to crack. He refuses to answer. Not once. Not twice. But again and again. Next question, he says, voice tight, jaw locked. The tension builds. Every refusal fuels another rumor. Online, the headlines multiply. Cover up in California? Newsom's audit nightmare. Billions lost. No answers. What began as a bureaucratic procedure now feels like the beginning of a scandal. But to understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what California represents. For years, it wasn't just a state. It was an idea. The dream of progressivism made real. A model for the nation's future. Green energy. Social programs, innovation, equality, and Gavin Newsom, he was the face of that dream. The polished, telegenic leader who promised to build a California for all. But behind the slogans, something darker was brewing. Billions poured into homelessness programs. Yet the streets of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Oakland only grew more crowded with tents. Funds for climate reform disappeared into consulting fees and administrative costs. Pandemic relief projects inflated budgets, then quietly vanished. The audit wasn't just about numbers, it was about broken trust. Picture this. Rows of state accountants locked in conference rooms, their screens filled with spreadsheets, red flags everywhere. Whistleblowers whispering about phantom, grants and shell nonprofits, documents, leaking one after another, each one painting a picture of chaos, disguised as compassion. And through it all, Newsom's team insists it's all political theater, federal overreach, they call it, a partisan attack. But behind closed doors, the panic is real. Emails are being deleted. Legal teams are being briefed. And somewhere in Washington, an investigator opens a folder marked simply, California. Every story has a breaking point. And this one is getting close. For years, Newsom built his image as the reformer, the man who could manage California's contradictions, the tech capital and the poverty capital, the wealth of Silicon Valley and the despair of Skid Row. But now, the same empire he built his career on is turning against him, because when billions go missing, even charisma can't hide the cracks, and somewhere deep down, in that moment at the podium, you can almost see it, the look of a man realizing that the storm isn't just around him, it's coming for him. What started as an audit has become an investigation into the very soul of California's leadership. And as the headlines spiral and allies grow silent, one question echoes across the state. Was this just mismanagement? Or something much bigger? Before the storm, there was the shine. Long before federal audits and political earthquakes, Gavin Newsom was the symbol of a new California. Youthful, ambitious, and cinematic in every sense of the word. He wasn't just a politician. He was a brand, born into privilege, molded by San Francisco's elite. Newsom carried himself like someone born for the camera. His hair, his posture, his calm control, everything about him radiated the image of leadership before he ever sat in a governor's chair. The press called him the modern prince of progressivism, and for a while, he lived up to it. It began in San Francisco, a city of contradictions, where billionaires lived next to tent encampments, and tech dreams collided with human struggle. In the early 2000s, Newsom, then a young, charming entrepreneur turned politician, was already making headlines. He spoke about compassion, equality, and innovation, the holy trinity of California progressivism. But he also understood something most politicians didn't. Image was power. He knew how to look like the future, and in an era obsessed with optics, that made him unstoppable. His political ascent wasn't just fueled by ideology, it was powered by connections. Silicon Valley's tech titans saw in Newsom a reflection of themselves. Sleek, data-driven, and future-obsessed. He spoke their language: sustainability, disruption, growth. In return, they opened their checkbooks. Behind closed doors, Newsom built an empire of influence. Campaigns funded by tech moguls, appearances at Hollywood galas, photo ops with climate activists and CEOs. He surrounded himself with California's cultural elite, the actors, the innovators, the dreamers. But beneath the glamour was calculation. Every handshake, every headline, every camera angle, meticulously curated. He wasn't just governing. He was producing a narrative, one that would one day propel him beyond Sacramento, perhaps even to the White House. During those years, California felt invincible. The economy was booming. Tesla was redefining transportation. Apple and Google were rewriting the rules of modern life. And standing beside that surge of innovation was Gavin Newsom, preaching a new gospel, that capitalism and climate responsibility could coexist. It was here that his path briefly crossed with another California, visionary Elon Musk. When Tesla was still a fragile dream built in Silicon Valley garages, Newsom saw potential. He championed electric vehicles before they were fashionable. California's green energy incentives became a lifeline for Tesla's early expansion. Both men spoke of the future, but in very different dialects. For Newsom, the future was political: clean energy, sustainable housing, public transformation. For Musk, it was mechanical: rockets, cars, algorithms, and escape velocity. One sought to perfect the system, the other wanted to leave it behind. And in that divergence lay the story of modern California itself, the tension between idealism and innovation. In the early years, the media couldn't get enough of him. Magazine covers called him the Kennedy of the West Coast. He legalized same-sex marriage in San Francisco before it was popular nationally, a bold move that made him both a hero and a target. Crowds adored his courage, and cameras adored his composure. He smiled through controversy, navigated scandals with style, and always managed to turn backlash into momentum. Each criticism became proof of his conviction. Each headline, another step up the ladder. He understood something fundamental. California loved a good story, and Gavin Newsom was the story. But success breeds distance. The more his power grew, the less he seemed to touch the ground he once promised to lift. The mayor became a governor. The reformer became the establishment. The young idealist who once walked the streets of San Francisco with activists now traveled by motorcade. Surrounded by advisors and publicists, the people who once saw him as their champion began to whisper, "He talks like us." But does he still see us? Behind the polished speeches and the sleek PR machine, a quiet transformation was taking place. Politics had turned from purpose to performance. And somewhere along the line, Gavin Newsom became a master of optics over outcomes. Still, to many he remained untouchable. When he spoke, it felt like progress was possible again. When he promised, It sounded like certainty. He was the future, or at least, he knew how to play the part convincingly. But power, in California, is fragile. It moves fast, it burns bright, and it often consumes its own. As tech money deepened its roots in politics, the same donors who built his empire began demanding influence in return. Policies started to shift, not always in favor of the people, but of the partnerships that funded them, and quietly, a new kind of California was taking shape. One where the lines between governance and corporate interest blurred, where optimism became marketing, and transparency became illusion. By the time Newsom took the governor's office, the transformation was complete. His network spanned Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Wall Street, and Washington. He had the look of a leader and the resources of a movement, but the man who once spoke about equality now presided over a state with the highest poverty rate in the nation. The press still framed him as the golden boy, the one destined for the national stage. But inside California, cracks were forming, homelessness soared, taxes climbed. And yet, his approval ratings held on for a while there because the story still worked until it didn't. Every rise carries within it the seed of its own fall. The same image that made him invincible would one day become his greatest liability, because when the lights fade and the numbers don't add up, image alone can't hold the weight of truth. The golden boy of California was flying high, surrounded by power, money, and belief. But beneath the surface, systems were failing, money was vanishing, and trust, the foundation of his rise, was beginning to erode. And though no one knew it yet, the story that began with admiration was about to descend into suspicion, because in California, the higher the glow, the darker the shadow it casts. The documents arrived quietly, no press release, no cameras, just a sealed envelope marked Confidential, Federal Oversight Division. Inside it, the first fragments of what would become the most explosive audit in California's modern history, thousands of pages. Financial reports, internal memos, unapproved transfers, the kind of paperwork designed to confuse, not to clarify. What began as a routine inquiry into state spending had turned into a descent through layers of bureaucracy and deceit. Each spreadsheet told a story, not of policy, but of power. At the surface, the numbers looked fine. Budgets balanced, programs funded, boxes checked, but as investigators followed the flow of money, the numbers started to bend, twist, and vanish. Millions, earmarked for public outreach, found their way into private consulting firms. Homelessness grants were redirected to nonprofits that shared donors with Newsom's campaign. And pandemic relief funds, billions meant for hospitals and frontline aid, were split into dozens of emergency contracts, some with no visible oversight, others tied to companies that didn't even exist 5 years ago. What the audit uncovered wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every transaction, every approval, every signature led somewhere and someone. The deeper they looked, the more deliberate it felt. Money moved in circles. Budgets inflated, then trimmed, then inflated again. It was a dance between the public and the private, one keeping up appearances, the other collecting dividends, and behind the balance sheets, familiar names began to emerge. Donors, lobbyists, political allies, individuals who, on paper, had no connection to policy, yet somehow appeared again and again in footnotes and funding lists. A former state auditor, speaking under anonymity, described it like this: "It's not just about missing money, it's about invisible control. Every dollar was a message, a favor, a promise, or a payoff." Whistleblowers started coming forward, cautiously, often through encrypted channels. One, leaked internal correspondence between senior staffers approving temporary reallocations to nonprofits that didn't even file annual reports. Another revealed that certain state contractors were registered to P.O. boxes shared with campaign offices. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Funds intended to help the public seemed to be feeding a network of insiders, consultants, advisors, and financiers who orbited the governor's political machinery. A former communications aide put it bluntly, it was never about fixing the problem. It was about looking like we were fixing it and getting paid for the performance. The audit's early findings were damning, but what made it dangerous was who it implicated. The trail didn't stop at agencies or departments. It reached campaign committees, private boards, and eventually, the governor's inner circle. Emails obtained through subpoenas revealed conversations about expedited contracts and strategic partners. One memo detailed how a pilot program for housing assistance redirected tens of millions into a firm run by a longtime donor. Another referenced emergency pandemic infrastructure that existed only on paper. Every discovery deepened the sense that the audit wasn't just exposing negligence. It was pulling at the threads of a carefully woven system. As the investigation grew, the silence inside Sacramento became deafening. Publicly, Newsom's office dismissed it all as partisan noise. Privately, staffers began to vanish. Resignations disguised as personal reasons, phones wiped clean, meeting notes destroyed. A senior policy advisor, now a whistleblower, later revealed, we were told not to ask questions. That if we wanted a career, we'd keep our heads down and stay loyal. But loyalty has limits, especially when loyalty starts to look like complicity. The audit team, a small, specialized unit out of Washington, began to map the flow of funds like a criminal network. Their charts showed webs of shell organizations and dummy accounts, all tied back to a handful of corporate intermediaries. The picture forming wasn't random, it was systemic. Programs that promised transparency had built walls of secrecy. Initiatives framed as reform became tools for self-preservation. The money wasn't just missing, it was redirected with purpose. One investigator described the state's financial ecosystem as a hydra, cut off one head, and two more appeared. Each reform created another loophole. Each layer of oversight concealed another layer beneath it. Then came the leak. Late one night, an encrypted file appeared in the inbox of a Sacramento journalist known for his persistence. Inside were pages of audit summaries, internal memos and payment authorizations, all marked internal use only. The data told a story the public had never seen multi-million-dollar contracts awarded to companies with no staff. Public funds routed through nonprofits that shared addresses with campaign donors. In some cases, the same individuals signing off on approvals were also recipients of the funds through consulting arrangements. Within hours, the journalist's story went live and the illusion shattered. The headlines spread faster than the damage could be controlled. California audit uncovers billions in mismanaged funds. Whistleblowers link political donors to state contracts. Calls for federal oversight intensify. Administration scrambled to contain the fallout, framing it as a misunderstanding of complex funding structures. But the damage was done. The public had seen the pattern, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. What had started as an inquiry into accounting errors was now unraveling into something far more dangerous, a portrait of systemic corruption under the banner of progress. As the audit widened, its tone shifted. It was no longer just an investigation into numbers. It was a confrontation with a culture, a system built on loyalty, ambition, and silence. California's government, once a model of modern liberal governance, began to look eerily familiar, not as a beacon of reform, but as a reflection of the very corruption it claimed to fight. And as one investigator summarized in their final preliminary report, the issue is not the misuse of funds. It's the normalization of it. The system no longer knows what honesty looks like. For the people of California, the revelation struck a nerve. After years of promises, campaigns, and polished speeches, the audit revealed something that no slogan could hide. that progress without integrity is just illusion, and illusion, once broken, can't be rebuilt. The Golden State had always been a dream, but as the documents piled up and the evidence grew impossible to ignore, that dream began to look more like a mirage, because the deeper the auditors dug, the more one truth became clear. This wasn't just about money lost. It was about trust, squandered, sold, and buried in the books. It was only a matter of time before two visions of California and of America itself collided. On one side, Gavin Newsom, the polished son of California politics, shaped by dynasties, donors, and carefully crafted narratives. On the other, Elon Musk, the unpredictable force of raw innovation, disruption, and rebellion. Their collision wasn't just personal, it was ideological. One man believed in government as the architect of progress. The other believed government was the obstacle. Standing in its way, the tension had been simmering for years. When Musk first arrived in California, he was hailed as the perfect symbol of the state's future. Electric cars, clean energy, bold ideas. Newsom embraced that image, proudly calling California the launchpad of human progress. For a time, their stories ran parallel, both fueled by ambition, both selling visions of transformation, but visions can diverge. By the late 2010s, Musk's tone had shifted. What began as subtle frustrations with regulations turned into open defiance. He mocked bureaucratic hurdles, blasted environmental red tape, and accused the state of suffocating innovation with endless paperwork. And behind the scenes, those frustrations were shared by countless business owners who once worshipped California's promise, now packing up and leaving. Then came the pandemic. California lockdown. Tesla's Fremont factory was forced to close. Musk lashed out publicly. "This is fascist," he said, a line that shattered the uneasy alliance between the state's most visible innovator and its most powerful politician. Newsom tried to maintain control. He called Musk's remarks unfortunate, but behind the scenes, aides scrambled. Musk's influence was growing, not politically, but culturally. Millions followed him, echoed him, and saw in his defiance a reflection of their own exhaustion with the system. That's when the symbolic migration began. Musk moved Tesla's headquarters to Texas. He shifted SpaceX expansion to Florida, and when he acquired Twitter, renaming it simply X, the message was clear. California wasn't the capital of innovation anymore. It was the bureaucracy Musk was escaping. And yet, for Newsom, this wasn't just about a billionaire's tantrum. It was personal, because Musk wasn't merely criticizing policy. He was dismantling the myth of California itself. The myth Newsom had built. His career upon clips flood the screen, Musk in interviews, saying California once led the world. Now it's a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Newsom smiles through gritted teeth at press conferences, insisting that California remains the envy of the world. But the data tells another story. Hundreds of companies had already left. Tech migration was accelerating. Tax revenue was dipping. And now, the federal audit was exposing holes in the very programs Newsom had used to define his legacy. Social media caught fire. Musk's followers began amplifying reports from the audit, snippets of leaked documents, pie charts, charts connecting donors to contracts, memes comparing Newsom to Emperor Nero of Sacramento. The narrative shifted from policy to parody, from governance to spectacle. Every move Newsom made to defend himself only seemed to feed the flames. His PR team rolled out interviews, glossy videos, and photo ops with renewable energy startups. But the internet wasn't buying it. The comment sections became digital battlegrounds. If California is so great, why is everyone leaving? Newsom built his empire on fantasy economics. Musk is the real leader now. For the first time, California's governor wasn't just fighting political opponents, he was fighting the algorithm and losing. As the election cycle began to heat up, Musk's critiques took on new life. He wasn't running for anything, But his influence was reshaping everything. Every tweet he made became a headline. Every dig at California's leadership turned into a national debate. The brain drain wasn't just an economic issue anymore. It was a cultural rebellion. Newsom, cornered by scandals and federal scrutiny, doubled down. He toured cities promising reforms, transparency, new accountability measures. But even his supporters sensed fatigue. The man once seen as the future of the Democratic Party now looked like the face of an old political machine. Worn, defensive, reactive, and Musk? He was no longer just a businessman. He had become the voice of a generation disillusioned with politics, a symbol of rebellion against control. Whether you loved him or hated him, you couldn't ignore him. He represented a truth that no press release could erase. California was changing, and the empire Newsom had built was cracking, under the weight of its own contradictions. The headlines were relentless. Tesla's departure marks new era. Musk declares California lost. Federal audit deepens as state denies. Wrongdoing, each headline chipped away at the foundation of a legacy that once seemed untouchable. The tension between the visionary governor and the renegade entrepreneur wasn't just drama, it was a mirror reflecting America's deeper divide between those who believed in the system and those who believed it was broken beyond repair. And as the investigation dug deeper, it became clear the battle between Musk and Newsom wasn't just about policy or pride, it was about the soul of California itself. Because behind every audit, every headline, and every viral post, one question loomed: who really owns the future, the ones who build it or the ones who regulate it? And that question was about to ignite a political firestorm that neither man could control. It began like a leak, small, containable, almost forgettable. But leaks have a way of becoming floods. Within weeks, the headlines that once praised Gavin Newsom's leadership began to sound different, sharper, colder. The same networks that once hailed him as the Democratic golden boy now asked the questions his own party had been avoiding. The audit report was out, and it was damning. Pages upon pages of financial inconsistencies, untraceable grants, inflated contracts, and inexplicable transfers buried in bureaucratic language. Programs meant for homelessness showed millions spent, but no clear results. Climate initiatives had ballooned in cost while emissions barely moved. Pandemic relief funds had administrative losses that no one could explain. The camera cuts to a hearing room, fluorescent lights humming, the air thick with tension. Lawmakers sit in rows, shuffling through papers, reading aloud the words that would reshape California politics. Each line of the report felt like another thread unraveling a carefully woven myth. And at the center of it all was Newsom. He wasn't in the room that day, but his presence lingered in every question, every headline, every silence. Was this corruption or incompetence? Negligence or design? The country watched, and for the first time, the narrative of California as a utopia of progress began to look like an illusion. Donors started to back away quietly. Hollywood, once his most loyal stage, fell silent. Even late-night hosts, his unofficial PR allies, began cracking jokes that cut too close to home. The polls reflected the shift. Approval ratings dropping by double digits. Trust eroding faster than any campaign could repair. And yet, there he was, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, talking about moving forward. The performance continued, but the stage lights were dimming. What had once been charisma now looked like denial. Every public appearance felt rehearsed, mechanical, stripped of sincerity. Behind closed doors, staffers whispered of exhaustion. The machine that had built Newsom's political empire, the donors, strategists, PR experts, when was fracturing. Some left quietly, others began leaking stories to the press, internal memos, private messages, even photos, all feeding a media frenzy that no amount of spin could contain. The federal hearings turned into political theater. Republicans, called it proof of systemic corruption. Democrats called it a painful but necessary reckoning. But outside those walls, ordinary Californians weren't interested in speeches. They were angry. Homelessness was worse than ever. Businesses were leaving. And now, they were being told billions had vanished, somewhere inside the machinery of their own government. Reporters crowded the state capitol steps, cameras flashing like lightning, each question sharper than the last. Governor, did you know about these misused funds? Were your donors involved? Do you take responsibility? Newsom paused, that same polished pause that once came off as confidence. Now, it sounded like avoidance. He talked about context, about complexities, about moving forward. But no one was listening anymore. The illusion had broken. In the background, a different kind of narrative was taking shape, not from the news networks but from the internet. Clips of the hearings went viral. Musk's followers reposted them with captions like, "Told you." So, memes compared California to a sinking ship, and Newsom to the captain rearranging chairs on the deck. Even his allies began to sense the shift. The public mood had turned, and no amount of optimism could pull it back. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was an unraveling, political, psychological, almost existential. Because Gavin Newsom wasn't just a governor, he was a symbol, a projection of everything California told itself it could be: progressive, moral, enlightened. And now, as the truth surfaced, that symbol was collapsing under the weight of its contradictions. Still, in quieter moments, the question that lingered wasn't simply what went wrong, it was why. Was Newsom the villain of this story? Or just another product of the system that created him? A system built on image, not accountability, on donors, not voters, on the illusion of progress, rather than progress itself. As the hearings dragged on, that question grew louder. Each revelation didn't just expose a broken government, it exposed a broken faith. People were no longer arguing about budgets or policies. They were arguing about trust. And when trust breaks, it doesn't make a sound, it just disappears. By the time the cameras turned off and the headlines moved on, something irreversible had shifted. The empire Gavin Newsom spent decades building was still standing, but hollow, a monument to how power can outlive credibility. Reminder that no matter how bright the image, truth eventually finds its way through the cracks. The story closes not with chaos, but with silence, a silence heavy with reflection. Because in the end, this wasn't just the fall of a politician, it was a warning. Story about what happens when theater replaces reality. When ambition forgets accountability, and when a system built to serve the people begins serving itself instead. The final shot lingers on the California skyline, once a symbol of hope, now tinted with uncertainty. And somewhere in that haze, a question remains. Was Gavin Newsom merely a symptom of a broken system? Or was he the one who perfected it? Power is a strange thing. It never truly disappears. It just changes shape. Sometimes it wears a suit and stands behind a podium. Other times it hides behind a screen, an algorithm, or a viral post. California, once the land of gold, dreams, and reinvention, had become a mirror reflecting that transformation. In Gavin Newsom's story, we saw the old order, the political dynasty, the polished speeches, the belief that image could bend reality. In Elon Musk's rise, we saw the new, raw, decentralized, driven by data and disruption instead of decorum. Two men, two visions, and between them, the question that now defines America: who controls the future? Those who govern it, or those who create it? When the dust of the audit settled, the headlines faded and the chaos dimmed, California stood at a crossroads. The hearings had exposed corruption and complacency, but they had also exposed something deeper: fatigue, a collective disillusionment. Because people weren't just losing faith in politicians, They were losing faith in systems. The institutions built to serve were now being questioned by the very citizens they claimed to protect. And yet, in that uncertainty, there was something oddly hopeful. A sense that perhaps this unraveling was necessary, that sometimes truth has to burn through illusion before something real can take its place. Newsom faded from the spotlight, his legacy rewritten not by his speeches, but by the Audit's ink. Musk continued to move forward, not untouched, but unbound. To some, he became the new face of progress. To others, just another empire in the making, because the cycle of power never truly ends. It only reinvents its players. The world had shifted from the hands of politicians to the platforms of technologists. Elections were no longer won in town halls, but in timelines. Influence wasn't measured in votes, but in views. And in that new digital frontier, truth itself became fluid, edited, filtered, monetized. But the story of California was more than politics or technology. It was a reflection of us, our appetite for spectacle, our addiction to image, our tendency to mistake charisma for competence. Every leader we elevate carries a piece of our own desire to believe in something bigger, and every downfall reminds us how fragile that faith really is. The camera drifts across the California skyline, skyscrapers glinting under a dying sun, the Pacific swallowing light as it always does. Somewhere beyond that horizon, another figure is rising, another narrative taking shape, because that's how empires fall, not with silence, but with substitution. One image fades, another takes its place, and yet, as the city lights flicker on, a thought lingers. Maybe collapse isn't always destruction. Maybe it's a reckoning, a moment when illusion meets consequence. When we finally see that the mirror of power doesn't just reflect our leaders, it reflects us, because in every promise broken, in every scandal uncovered, in every truth denied, there's a lesson about the kind of world we've allowed to exist. And perhaps, the kind of world we still have the power to rebuild. The screen fades to black. A quiet voice remains, steady, reflective, final. Empires don't always fall in silence. Sometimes they broadcast their own collapse.